I have seen people spend millions trying to earn respect, but the greatest man I ever heard about walked away from the most important moment of his life without even leaving his name behind. The afternoon skyline of downtown Seattle shimmered beneath a pale autumn sun, its glass towers reflecting streaks of silver across rain-damp streets while hurried office workers crossed busy intersections carrying coffee cups and briefcases as if every minute carried the weight of another deadline. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm of distant traffic, muted conversations, and the soft rumble of commuter trains gliding through the heart of downtown. Few people noticed the tall black sport utility vehicle easing toward a crowded crosswalk near the entrance of Hayes Innovations, one of the country's fastest-growing technology companies. Even fewer noticed the woman stepping away from the revolving glass doors with her attention fixed on an urgent conversation through a wireless earpiece. Victoria Hayes rarely looked up when work demanded every ounce of her focus. At 38 years old, she had become one of the youngest female chief executive officers in the technology industry, respected by investors, admired by employees, and envied by competitors. Success surrounded her every day, yet peace had become something she postponed for another meeting, another quarter, another impossible goal. Her tailored cream-colored business suit matched the confidence she projected to the world, but the exhaustion beneath her warm hazel eyes told a quieter story that nobody inside the boardroom ever noticed. She ended the call with a polite thank you, slipped her phone into her purse, and stepped toward the curb just as dozens of pedestrians began crossing together beneath the changing traffic signal. Across the street, Daniel Carter balanced 2 grocery bags in one hand while gently holding the smaller hand of his 9-year-old daughter, Emma, with the other. Emma looked up at the towering buildings with the same wonder children reserved for places that adults had forgotten to admire. "Dad," she said with a smile, "do people really work all day inside those buildings?" Daniel laughed softly. "Most of them probably do." Emma tilted her head thoughtfully. "Do they ever get to see the sky?" Daniel looked upward where scattered clouds drifted lazily between skyscrapers. "I hope they remember to." Emma smiled, satisfied by the answer, then pointed excitedly toward a bakery across the street where fresh cinnamon rolls filled the window display. Daniel promised they would stop after dropping off the replacement part he had just picked up for the apartment building where he worked in maintenance. Life had never given Daniel much extra money, but it had taught him something far more valuable. Every ordinary afternoon held opportunities to become the kind of person his daughter would someday remember with pride. As father and daughter approached the intersection, Daniel noticed something that did not quite fit the rhythm around him. A delivery van had stopped several yards short of the crosswalk while its driver leaned outside the open window, waving urgently towards someone ahead. Most pedestrians continued walking without understanding why. Daniel instinctively looked farther down the street. Victoria had already stepped into the crosswalk, still unaware that a large advertising display mounted high above a nearby construction platform had begun swaying after an unexpected mechanical failure loosened part of its support. Workers shouted warnings from above. Several people looked upward in confusion. The sounds blended into the ordinary noise of downtown until Daniel recognized the urgency hidden beneath them. Everything seemed to slow. Emma looked toward her father just in time to see his expression change from relaxed to completely focused. He gently set both grocery bags onto the sidewalk and squeezed her shoulder. "Stay right here, sweetheart." She nodded immediately because she trusted his voice more than she understood the situation. Daniel crossed the first few yards with calm determination rather than panic. Victoria finally looked up after hearing someone shout her name from behind, but confusion held her still for one brief heartbeat as the heavy display structure shifted farther than anyone expected. Before fear could fully reach her, Daniel reached her. "Ma'am," he said firmly but kindly, "come with me." She barely had time to register the calm confidence in his voice before he guided her several quick steps away from the center of the crosswalk toward the wider pedestrian safety area beside the intersection. Other pedestrians moved with them as workers continued directing people away until the area was secured. Within moments, city crews and building staff responded, creating a safe perimeter while traffic paused and emergency personnel arrived to assess the situation. The crowd buzzed with anxious relief, grateful that everyone nearby had been guided away before anyone was harmed. Victoria stood perfectly still, catching her breath as the reality of what had almost happened slowly settled into her heart. She turned toward the man who had calmly led her to safety, ready to thank him, but Daniel was already looking back across the street. Emma waited exactly where he had asked, standing beside the grocery bags with remarkable patience, her small face filled with concern rather than fear. Daniel smiled reassuringly at her before turning back toward Victoria. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly. I think so." Her voice sounded quieter than she expected. Daniel offered the faintest smile. "That is what matters." Victoria reached toward him instinctively. "Please wait. I need to know your name." Daniel glanced once more toward Emma, who now waved gently to let him know she was fine. He looked back at Victoria with the same humble kindness that had steadied her only moments earlier. "Someone is waiting for me," he said softly. "Take care of yourself." Before she could ask another question, Daniel walked back across the sidewalk toward his daughter, picked up the grocery bags, accepted the warm hug Emma immediately gave him, and together they disappeared into the afternoon crowd like two ordinary people returning to an ordinary day. Victoria stood frozen beneath the towering skyline, surrounded by concerned employees, security officers, and grateful bystanders, yet the only face she could think about belonged to a man whose quiet blue eyes carried no desire for recognition, and whose name had vanished into the city before anyone had the chance to ask for it. Some moments stay with us not because they were loud, but because they quietly remind us that one stranger's kindness can change the direction of another person's entire life. Victoria Hayes stood silently inside the executive conference room on the 34th floor of Hayes Innovations while floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Seattle skyline she had conquered through years of determination and sacrifice. The city looked exactly as it had every other afternoon, yet somehow everything felt different. Board members discussed quarterly earnings. Financial projections glowed across massive presentation screens. Marketing executives debated expansion plans into new international markets. Voices filled the room with numbers, strategies, and confident predictions, but Victoria heard almost none of them. Her thoughts remained fixed on the calm blue eyes of the man who had gently guided her away from danger before quietly disappearing back into the crowd with his young daughter. She remembered every detail except the one she needed most. His name. "Victoria?" her chief financial officer asked carefully. "Are you with us?" She blinked, realizing every executive around the polished walnut table was waiting for her response. Victoria offered an apologetic smile. "I am sorry. Could you repeat the last question?" The room grew unusually quiet. In nearly 10 years as chief executive officer, she had never lost focus during a meeting. Her assistant, Melissa Grant, watched with gentle concern from the far end of the room. She knew Victoria well enough to recognize that something far more important than business had occupied her thoughts. After the meeting finally ended, Melissa followed Victoria into her private office carrying a neatly organized folder of afternoon appointments. "Would you like me to reschedule your interviews?" she asked softly. Victoria slowly removed her blazer before standing beside the large windows overlooking downtown Seattle. The afternoon sun reflected across countless glass buildings while tiny figures hurried along sidewalks far below. "Melissa," she said quietly, "do you believe it is possible to owe your life to someone you may never see again?" Melissa hesitated only briefly. "I think it is possible." Victoria nodded slowly. "Then I owe everything to a man whose name I do not even know." Melissa set the folder aside. "Tell me what happened." Victoria described the entire encounter exactly as she remembered it. The crowded intersection. The calm voice. The respectful way the stranger had asked her to move without frightening her. The little girl waiting patiently across the street. The grocery bags. The gentle smile. The quiet goodbye. When she finished speaking, silence settled comfortably inside the office. Melissa finally smiled. "He never asked who you were." Victoria looked toward the skyline again. "I do not think he cared. Most people would have stayed." Victoria nodded. Most people would have. She lowered her eyes thoughtfully. He looked more concerned about getting back to his daughter than explaining what he had done. Melissa folded her hands together. That tells you almost everything about the kind of father he must be. Victoria smiled faintly. Exactly. Meanwhile, several miles away in a modest neighborhood lined with maple trees just beginning to glow with autumn colors, Daniel Carter unlocked the front door of the small white house he shared with Emma. The scent of cinnamon and apples drifted warmly through the kitchen after Emma insisted on helping bake a simple dessert using her grandmother's handwritten recipe. Soft afternoon sunlight spilled through lace curtains while an old jazz station played quietly from a radio resting on the kitchen counter. The house was not large, but every corner reflected care instead of wealth. Family photographs filled the hallway. Children's artwork decorated the refrigerator. A pair of well-used work boots rested neatly beside the front door. Emma carried the grocery bags toward the counter before looking up at her father. Dad? Daniel smiled as he unpacked fresh vegetables. Yes, sweetheart? Was that lady scared today? Daniel paused for a moment before answering honestly. I think anyone would have been. Emma slowly placed a carton of milk into the refrigerator. You helped her the same way you always help people. Daniel laughed softly. I hope most people would have done the same thing. Emma shook her head with the simple certainty only children possessed. Not everybody notices when someone needs help. Daniel looked at his daughter with quiet pride. I am glad you notice. Emma smiled brightly. Because you taught me to. Daniel reached over and gently brushed a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face. The world becomes a better place every time someone chooses to pay attention. Emma thought carefully about those words while stirring cinnamon into the apple filling. Do you think she will ever find you again? Daniel smiled without looking up from slicing fresh bread for dinner. I do not think she needs to. Emma frowned slightly. Why not? Daniel placed the knife carefully onto the cutting board before kneeling so they were eye level. Helping someone is not supposed to create a debt. Emma listened quietly. Then why do people always say thank you? Daniel smiled warmly. Because gratitude reminds us that kindness matters. But kindness should never depend on whether someone remembers our name. Emma nodded thoughtfully, absorbing another lesson she would likely carry for the rest of her life. Across town, Victoria sat alone in her office long after every executive had gone home. The city lights gradually replaced the fading afternoon sun while rain began tapping softly against the windows. She opened the security footage collected from nearby cameras around the intersection, hoping for one clear image of the stranger who had quietly changed everything. Several recordings showed the crowded sidewalk. Others captured passing traffic. One camera briefly revealed the man guiding her away before turning back toward a little girl holding grocery bags. Victoria paused the video on the single frame where his face was visible. The image was slightly blurred, but his calm expression remained unmistakable. She looked at the frozen screen for several long moments before whispering almost to herself. Wherever you are, I hope someone takes care of you the way you took care of me. Outside, the rain continued falling over Seattle, washing the city streets beneath thousands of glowing lights, while somewhere beyond the towering office buildings, Daniel and Emma quietly shared homemade apple pie at their small kitchen table, completely unaware that one act of ordinary kindness had already begun changing two lives in ways either of them could yet imagine. I have often wondered whether the people who quietly change the world ever realize how extraordinary they truly are, or whether they simply wake up each morning believing they are doing what any decent person would do. Before the sun had fully risen above Seattle, Daniel Carter was already unlocking the maintenance office of Cedar Ridge Apartments, a modest brick complex tucked between tree-lined streets where families knew one another by name. A cool autumn breeze carried the scent of damp cedar and freshly brewed coffee from a nearby neighborhood cafe while golden leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalks. The city had not yet reached its usual pace, and Daniel appreciated those peaceful hours before telephones rang and repair requests filled his schedule. He hung his weathered work jacket beside the office door, picked up his toolbox, and smiled as the property manager greeted him with a friendly wave. Morning, Daniel. Mrs. Ramirez says her kitchen sink is making strange noises again. Daniel laughed softly. I think the sink likes having someone to talk to. The manager chuckled. You are probably the only maintenance technician who says things like that. Daniel shrugged with quiet amusement. Machines usually tell us what they need if we are patient enough to listen. Moments later he was kneeling beneath the elderly woman's sink, carefully tightening a loose fitting while Mrs. Ramirez stood nearby apologizing for calling him so early. I hope I am not bothering you, she said gently. Daniel smiled without looking up. Helping people is never a bother. Mrs. Ramirez folded her hands together gratefully. Your daughter must be proud to have a father like you. Daniel paused briefly before answering. I hope she learns to become even kinder than I am. Mrs. Ramirez smiled warmly. Then she already has the right teacher. By the time he finished the repair, sunlight had begun filtering through the apartment windows, casting warm golden light across polished countertops and family photographs that reminded Daniel why he loved his work. Every home carried different stories, different struggles, and different dreams, yet every family appreciated being treated with respect regardless of how ordinary their problems seemed. After finishing several more maintenance requests, Daniel drove to Emma's elementary school just before dismissal. Children poured through the front entrance carrying colorful backpacks almost larger than themselves while teachers stood smiling nearby, wishing everyone a pleasant afternoon. Emma spotted her father immediately and hurried toward him with the joyful confidence that only comes from knowing someone always keeps their promises. She wrapped both arms around him before looking up with bright blue eyes. Guess what happened today? Daniel accepted the hug with a smile. I have a feeling you are about to tell me. Emma grinned. Mrs. Wilson said my essay about kindness was the best one in the class. Daniel opened the passenger door of his pickup truck before answering. That sounds like something worth celebrating. Emma climbed inside and carefully buckled her seat belt. She asked where I learned to write like that. Daniel started the engine. And what did you tell her? Emma looked out the windshield thoughtfully. I said I watched my dad. Daniel laughed quietly, though emotion gently warmed his heart. That is a lot of responsibility. Emma shook her head. Not really. You make it look easy. On the drive home, they stopped at a neighborhood grocery store to buy ingredients for vegetable soup. Emma insisted on choosing the carrots because, according to her, the brightest ones always tasted sweeter. Daniel happily accepted her expert opinion while pushing the shopping cart through the produce section. Near the checkout lanes they noticed a young mother struggling to calm two energetic toddlers while trying to unload groceries onto the conveyor belt. Without hesitation, Daniel quietly stepped forward. Would it help if I held your cart still? He asked kindly. The exhausted mother smiled with obvious relief. That would help more than you know. Daniel steadied the cart, while Emma gently entertained one of the children by making funny faces until everyone finished checking out. The grateful mother thanked them repeatedly before leaving. Emma looked up at her father as they walked toward the parking lot. You always know when people need help. Daniel smiled gently. Most of the time people tell us without saying a single word. Emma thought carefully for several seconds. Do you think that lady from downtown was trying to tell people she needed help? Daniel understood immediately whom she meant. No, he answered honestly. Sometimes life surprises us before we have time to ask for anything. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I hope she is okay. Daniel placed the grocery bags inside the truck before closing the tailgate. I hope she is too. Across the city, Victoria Hayes sat inside a quiet conference room reviewing reports prepared by the company's security team. They had collected witness statements from everyone willing to speak about the incident outside headquarters. Several remembered seeing a tall man carrying grocery bags. Others remembered a little girl waiting nearby. One witness believed the child had called him Dad. Another recalled the man driving away in an older blue pickup truck. Melissa entered carrying another folder. Security found nothing else. Victoria slowly closed the reports. Not even a name? Melissa shook her head. No driver's license. No employee records. No surveillance with enough detail. Victoria looked once more at the single blurry image printed from the security camera. It feels strange. Melissa sat across from her. What does? Victoria smiled faintly. I spend my career solving complicated business problems with data, technology, and research. Yet the most important person I have ever needed to find left behind almost nothing except kindness. Melissa looked toward the photograph. Maybe kindness leaves better clues than names. Victoria folded the picture carefully before slipping it into a leather notebook she carried everywhere. Then I suppose I will have to start paying attention to different kinds of clues. Outside her office window, the afternoon sun slowly disappeared behind Seattle's skyline while somewhere across town Daniel and Emma stirred homemade vegetable soup together in their modest kitchen, laughing as steam fogged the windows and autumn rain quietly began falling once again. Completely unaware that the woman whose life had briefly crossed their own had just decided she would not stop searching until she thanked the Father who believed doing the right thing never required anyone to remember his name. I have learned that the people who deserve to be found are usually the ones making no effort to be seen, and perhaps that is why the search for genuine goodness always takes longer than anyone expects. 3 days passed, yet Daniel Carter never once mentioned the downtown incident again. To him it had already become another ordinary reminder that every person occasionally needed help. Life moved forward exactly as it always had. Before sunrise each morning he unlocked the maintenance workshop at Cedar Ridge Apartments, answered repair requests with patient determination, and greeted every resident with the same quiet respect regardless of whether they were young families, retired couples, or college students renting their first apartment. Autumn settled more deeply across Seattle, painting maple trees in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold while cool morning air carried the scent of damp earth and evergreen forests drifting in from the surrounding hills. Daniel spent one morning repairing a broken playground bench when neighborhood children gathered after school. Rather than replacing only the damaged boards, he quietly reinforced the entire structure so it would remain safe for years to come. When the apartment manager thanked him for doing extra work that nobody had requested, Daniel simply smiled. Children rarely notice who fixed the bench, he said. They only notice whether it is there when they need it. The manager watched him for a moment before shaking his head with admiration. You always think that way, do not you? Daniel shrugged modestly. Someone once did the same. For me. Later that afternoon he arrived at Emma's elementary school carrying a small paper bag from their favorite neighborhood bakery. Emma hurried toward him the moment the final bell rang. Is that what I think it is? She asked with excited eyes. Daniel pretended to consider the question seriously. That depends. Were you thinking about cinnamon muffins? Emma laughed. Yes. Daniel handed her the warm bag. Then your guess was remarkably accurate. They walked home together beneath rows of colorful trees while fallen leaves crunched softly beneath their shoes. Emma happily described a science experiment involving magnets, planets, and paper rockets, speaking so quickly that Daniel smiled simply from watching her enthusiasm. He never interrupted. He never checked his phone. Every story she shared mattered because she mattered. Across the city, however, another conversation was unfolding inside the executive offices of Hayes Innovations. Victoria Hayes stood before a digital map of downtown Seattle where Melissa had marked every location connected to the afternoon she had been rescued. Security footage, witness statements, nearby businesses, public transportation routes, and local traffic cameras filled the large interactive display. Any other investigation would probably have been solved by now. This one refused to become simple. Let us start with what we actually know, Melissa said calmly. Victoria nodded. He was carrying 2 grocery bags. Melissa added another note. A little girl around 9 years old was waiting across the street. Victoria continued. He drove an older blue pickup truck. Melissa looked thoughtfully at the screen. One witness believes he wore work boots. Victoria smiled faintly. That sounds strangely important. Melissa returned the smile. People who work with their hands often wear them everywhere. Victoria looked again at the paused security image. He also looked completely calm. Melissa nodded. Almost as though helping someone was part of his everyday life. Victoria folded her arms thoughtfully. I think that is exactly who he is. She turned toward the window overlooking the city below. Melissa, I do not want investigators following every blue truck in Seattle. Melissa looked surprised. You do not? Victoria slowly shook her head. No. If he truly wanted recognition, he would have stayed. I think we need to search differently. How? Victoria smiled gently. Find places where quiet people spend their time. Community centers. Volunteer programs. Neighborhood schools. Apartment maintenance companies. Churches. Local charities. Anywhere kindness matters more than titles. Melissa looked at her employer with quiet admiration. That sounds less like a business strategy. Victoria laughed softly. Maybe because this is no longer a business problem. The following Saturday morning, Victoria decided to leave the office behind for the first time in weeks. Wearing a simple navy sweater, blue jeans, and comfortable walking shoes instead of a tailored business suit, she visited Pike Place Market without security staff or media attention. The lively marketplace overflowed with fresh flowers, seasonal produce, handmade crafts, and local musicians filling the crisp autumn air with gentle acoustic melodies. Families wandered slowly between colorful stalls while children laughed beside displays of bright pumpkins and polished apples. Victoria found herself noticing ordinary moments she had ignored for years. A florist quietly gave an extra bouquet to an elderly customer. A baker slipped an additional cookie into a child's paper bag without charging another $1. A young employee patiently carried heavy groceries for an older couple. She suddenly understood something Daniel had unknowingly taught her in only a few brief seconds. Kindness rarely announced itself. It simply kept appearing wherever people chose to notice it. As she paused near a coffee stand, she overheard two volunteers discussing an upcoming neighborhood cleanup organized by several apartment communities on the north side of the city. One mentioned that a maintenance technician named Daniel was always the first person to arrive and the last one to leave every year. Victoria did not hear the last name because a passing delivery cart briefly drowned out the conversation, but she quietly wrote the first name into her notebook anyway. Daniel. It was the first real clue she had collected since the afternoon everything changed. At that exact moment, only a few miles away, Daniel and Emma were planting bright yellow chrysanthemums outside Mrs. Ramirez's apartment because she could no longer kneel comfortably to tend her small garden herself. Emma carefully patted fresh soil around each flower before smiling proudly. They look happier already. Mrs. Ramirez laughed warmly from her porch chair. Flowers grow better when children plant them with love. Daniel looked at his daughter with quiet gratitude before helping her brush the dirt from her small gardening gloves. Neither of them noticed that somewhere across the city, a single handwritten name resting inside a leather notebook had just become the first tiny thread connecting two completely different worlds that were slowly, quietly, and inevitably finding their way back toward each other. I have discovered that the greatest acts of kindness rarely happen only once because people who quietly help strangers usually spend their entire lives helping everyone around them without expecting anyone to notice. Monday morning arrived beneath a blanket of silver clouds hanging low over Seattle while a cool autumn drizzle coated rooftops, sidewalks, and maple leaves with tiny drops that shimmered beneath the first light of day. Daniel Carter parked his aging blue pickup truck beside the maintenance building at Cedar Ridge Apartments and smiled as he noticed a small line of pumpkins decorating the entrance. Emma had insisted the residents deserve something cheerful before Halloween, and several children had spent the previous afternoon painting smiling faces on each pumpkin. Daniel picked up his toolbox before stopping to straighten one pumpkin that had tipped sideways during the night. Much better, he whispered to himself with quiet satisfaction. Across the courtyard, 8-year-old Tyler Jenkins struggled to ride his bicycle without training wheels while his grandmother watched nervously from a nearby bench. Daniel noticed them immediately. Instead of walking straight to work, he crossed the courtyard with his familiar patient. Smile. Mind if I help for a few minutes? He asked. Tyler's grandmother smiled with relief. Only if you are not too busy. Daniel gently held the back of the bicycle seat while Tyler climbed aboard. Do not look down, Daniel encouraged. Look where you want to go. Tyler nodded determinedly. Daniel jogged beside him for several yards before quietly letting go without saying a word. The little boy continued pedaling several more feet before realizing he was riding completely on his own. His excited laughter echoed across the apartment courtyard. Tyler looked back with wide eyes. You let go. Daniel laughed warmly. Sometimes people are stronger than they think. They just need someone to believe it first. Tyler's grandmother wiped away a grateful tear. You always seem to arrive exactly when someone needs you. Daniel simply smiled and wished them both a wonderful day before continuing toward the maintenance office as though nothing unusual had happened. By late morning he was repairing a faulty heating unit for an elderly veteran named Harold Benson. The older man sat nearby wearing a faded military cap while Daniel patiently explained each step of the repair. Harold watched quietly before asking, You ever serve? Daniel nodded modestly. A few years. Harold smiled knowingly. I thought so. You carry yourself the same way. Daniel finished tightening the final connection before standing. There you go. You should be warm again before lunchtime. Harold reached for his wallet. At least let me give you something extra. Daniel gently shook his head. Your rent already covers the repair. Save your money for something that makes you smile. Harold looked at him with quiet respect. Your parents raised a remarkable man. Daniel smiled softly. They taught me that people remember how you treated them much longer than they remember what you owned. Several miles away, Victoria Hayes stepped out of a black sedan without the usual attention that followed a chief executive officer. Instead of heading toward another corporate meeting, she walked into a neighborhood community center where volunteers prepared boxed lunches for senior citizens and struggling families. Melissa accompanied her carrying only a notebook and a paper coffee cup. The center buzzed with cheerful conversation, folding tables, fresh bread, and volunteers of every age working together without concern for titles or backgrounds. Victoria spent the next hour helping package meals, quietly observing the people around her. Nobody recognized her expensive watch because nobody cared. What mattered here was whether someone was willing to help. An elderly volunteer named Margaret smiled as she handed Victoria another stack of lunch containers. You are learning quickly. Victoria laughed softly. I spend most of my days reading financial reports. This feels much more meaningful. Margaret nodded. Numbers build companies. Kindness builds communities. Those words stayed with Victoria long after the conversation ended. Before leaving, she casually asked whether anyone knew a maintenance technician named Daniel who volunteered around the city. Margaret thought for a moment before smiling. Daniel? She asked. There are several. One helps at the food pantry downtown. Another coaches Little League. I also know a Daniel who fixes apartments on the north side. Quiet fellow. Always arrives early. Never stays for recognition. Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken just slightly. Does he have a daughter? Margaret smiled. A sweet little blonde girl. Emma, I think. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment, trying not to let hope become visible too quickly. Do you know where he works? Margaret nodded. Cedar Ridge Apartments. Wonderful people over there. Melissa looked toward Victoria with quiet excitement, but Victoria gently raised one finger, reminding both of them to remain patient. Thank you, she said sincerely. You have been very helpful. That afternoon Daniel arrived at Emma's school just as children poured through the front entrance carrying colorful backpacks and handmade autumn decorations. Emma ran toward him carrying a folded sheet of construction paper covered in bright markers. Dad, I made something. Daniel unfolded the paper carefully. Across the top she had written in large letters, "Kindness is when nobody is watching." Beneath the sentence, she had drawn a picture of a father helping strangers while holding his daughter's hand. Daniel smiled, deeply touched. This is beautiful. Emma looked up proudly. Mrs. Wilson asked everyone to draw a hero. Daniel gently knelt so they were eye level. There are many heroes in the world. Emma nodded. I know. She pointed to the drawing. Mine just happens to live at my house. Daniel hugged her warmly before placing the picture inside his work folder so it would not wrinkle. As father and daughter walked toward the parking lot beneath gently falling autumn leaves, either of them noticed a black sedan quietly passing along the opposite street. Inside the car, Victoria glanced toward Cedar Ridge Apartments only a few blocks away before asking the driver to continue. She could have gone there immediately. She could have knocked on every maintenance office door until she found the man she had been searching for. Instead, she looked once more at the folded note inside her notebook where one simple word had changed everything. Daniel. She closed the notebook gently and whispered almost to herself. Some people deserve to be found the right way, not the fastest way. While only minutes away, the man she had crossed an entire city to discover laughed with his daughter over homemade hot chocolate, completely unaware that the distance separating their two worlds had quietly become smaller than ever before. I have come to believe that destiny rarely rushes because the most meaningful meetings are often prepared through countless quiet moments that neither person can see while they are living them. The following Saturday arrived beneath a brilliant blue Seattle sky washed clean by a night of gentle rain. Crisp autumn air carried the scent of evergreen trees and fresh coffee while sunlight danced across colorful leaves scattered along neighborhood sidewalks. Cedar Ridge Apartments buzzed with cheerful activity as residents gathered for the annual Fall Community Cleanup, an event where neighbors planted flowers, repaired garden beds, painted benches, and shared homemade meals beneath rows of bright orange and gold decorations. Daniel Carter unloaded rakes, shovels, flower bulbs, and gardening gloves from the back of his aging blue pickup truck before greeting every resident with the same warm smile he offered throughout the year. Emma hurried beside him carrying a cardboard box filled with packets of flower seeds. Mrs. Ramirez wants yellow flowers near the mailbox, she announced proudly. Daniel smiled. Then yellow flowers it is. Emma carefully handed seed packets to younger children while explaining exactly how deep each hole should be. Several parents quietly laughed as they watched the 9-year-old organize the entire planting project with surprising confidence. She definitely inherited your heart, one neighbor remarked. Daniel shook his head gently. She teaches me something new every day. Across town, Victoria Hayes stood inside her office looking at the handwritten address Melissa had carefully written onto a small note. Cedar Ridge Apartments. She had spent almost an entire week resisting the temptation to simply arrive unannounced. Something inside her insisted that gratitude deserved patience rather than urgency. Melissa stepped into the office carrying 2 insulated coffee cups. You have been staring at that address for 10 minutes. Victoria smiled sheepishly. I know. Melissa handed her 1 cup. You are afraid he will disappear again. Victoria looked out across the Seattle skyline before answering quietly. No. She paused thoughtfully. I am afraid I might interrupt a life that was already beautiful before I accidentally became part of it. Melissa nodded with quiet understanding. Then perhaps do not arrive as a chief executive officer. Victoria smiled. Exactly. An hour later, wearing blue jeans, comfortable boots, and a simple cream sweater instead of executive business attire, Victoria parked several streets away from Cedar Ridge Apartments. She wanted to walk the remaining distance, to see the neighborhood the way Daniel probably experienced it every day. Children laughed while riding bicycles beneath trees glowing with brilliant autumn colors. Elderly neighbors watered porch plants while exchanging friendly greetings across white picket fences. A local bakery filled the cool air with the comforting aroma of fresh bread and cinnamon pastries. Everything felt remarkably ordinary, yet deeply alive. Victoria realized she had spent years building extraordinary success while quietly forgetting the beauty hidden inside ordinary mornings. As she approached Cedar Ridge Apartments, cheerful music drifted across the courtyard where families worked together beneath strings of colorful autumn decorations. She stopped just outside the entrance, not wanting to intrude before understanding the event. A volunteer carrying gardening supplies smiled warmly. Welcome. Feel free to join us if you like. Victoria hesitated briefly. I was actually just walking through. The volunteer laughed kindly. That is how most people arrive. They usually leave carrying a shovel. Victoria smiled and accepted a pair of gardening gloves. Moments later, she found herself kneeling beside several neighborhood children planting bright tulip bulbs beneath a maple tree whose crimson leaves floated gently to the ground around them. No one recognized her. No one asked about board meetings, company earnings, or business awards. They simply thanked her for helping. It felt strangely peaceful. Several yards away, Daniel repaired a loose wooden fence surrounding the community playground while quietly explaining simple carpentry techniques to two curious teenagers who wanted to learn. He never spoke down to them. He handed each of them a measuring tape and patiently showed them how careful work mattered more than fast work. Emma carried bottles of water from one volunteer group to another before eventually stopping beside Victoria. "Hi," Emma said with an easy smile. "I have not seen you here before." Victoria looked up warmly. "It is my first time." Emma nodded approvingly. "People come back every year because everybody shares dessert afterward." Victoria laughed softly. "That sounds like an excellent tradition." Emma proudly pointed across the courtyard. "My dad started it." Victoria followed the little girl's finger without thinking. Daniel stood with his back partially turned while helping secure another fence board beneath warm afternoon sunlight. From that distance, she could only see the familiar posture of a man completely focused on helping someone else. Something inside her stirred with quiet recognition, though she could not explain why. Before she could study him more carefully, another volunteer called Daniel toward the opposite end of the courtyard to help move several heavy flower planters. He smiled, nodded, and walked away before Victoria ever saw his face. Emma noticed her looking. "My dad says flowers grow better when neighbors plant them together." Victoria smiled. "Your father sounds very wise." Emma shrugged with innocent certainty. "He just likes helping people." Victoria felt those simple words settle gently inside her heart. Somehow they sounded remarkably familiar. Throughout the afternoon she continued volunteering alongside residents, laughing with children, painting benches, planting flowers, and listening to stories about the maintenance technician everyone admired. Mrs. Ramirez happily told anyone willing to listen how Daniel always fixed problems before they became emergencies. Tyler proudly announced that Daniel had taught him to ride a bicycle without training wheels. Harold Benson smiled quietly while explaining that Daniel refused extra money because kindness was never something he believed should be sold. Each story revealed another small piece of the same man. None of them sounded extraordinary by themselves. Together they formed the portrait of someone who had quietly become the heart of an entire community without ever asking anyone to notice. As the afternoon drew toward evening, volunteers gathered beneath colorful picnic tents where homemade chili, warm bread, apple pie, and fresh cider filled long wooden tables. Victoria accepted a paper bowl of chili before turning just in time to notice Daniel walking toward the maintenance building carrying an empty toolbox. Their paths came within only a few yards of crossing before a group of excited children surrounded Daniel, asking him to judge the pumpkin decorating contest. He smiled and followed them across the courtyard while Victoria remained where she stood, watching only the back of the man she still did not recognize. The distance between them had never been smaller, yet fate quietly asked both of them for just a little more patience before allowing two lives that had already changed each other forever to finally meet face to face once again. I have learned that the clearest answers often appear only after we stop chasing them and begin quietly paying attention to the lives unfolding around us. Sunday morning settled gently over Cedar Ridge Apartments beneath a sky brushed with pale blue and drifting white clouds, while the cool autumn air carried the comforting scent of pine trees, fresh coffee, and damp earth after the previous night's light rain. Golden leaves rested across walking paths like scattered pieces of sunlight, and the flower beds planted during the community gathering already looked brighter beneath the morning light. Daniel Carter unlocked the maintenance workshop a little earlier than usual because several residents had requested help preparing their homes before colder weather arrived. He rolled open the large garage door, allowing crisp air to sweep through the room while birds sang from nearby maple branches. Emma sat at a small folding table beside the workshop finishing her weekend reading assignment before church, occasionally looking up just to smile at her father. Daniel glanced toward her between organizing tools. "How many chapters left?" Emma held up 2 fingers. "Only 2. Daniel nodded approvingly. I knew you would finish before I even asked? Emma grinned. Because you always believe I can. Daniel smiled softly. Believing in people usually helps them believe in themselves. Their conversation paused as a young resident approached carrying a broken wooden birdhouse. The little boy looked disappointed. Mr. Carter, the wind knocked it down. Daniel accepted the birdhouse carefully, examining the cracked corner. Looks like it just needs a little patience. The boy looked confused. Not glue? Daniel chuckled warmly. Sometimes patience is the best glue. Emma laughed because she had heard similar lessons many times before. Within 20 minutes, Daniel had carefully repaired the small birdhouse while explaining each step so the little boy could learn how to fix things himself. Someday, instead of simply handing it back, Daniel placed a tiny extra perch beneath the entrance. Birds like having a place to rest before they fly home. The boy's face lit up with excitement. It is even better now. Daniel shrugged modestly. Sometimes broken things teach us how to build something stronger. Several yards away, Mrs. Ramirez watched the exchange from her porch with quiet admiration. She smiled toward Emma. Your father speaks to children as though every word matters. Emma looked proudly toward Daniel. He says children remember how grown-ups make them feel. Mrs. Ramirez nodded gently. Your father remembers that better than almost anyone. At nearly the same hour, Victoria Hayes returned to Cedar Ridge Apartments carrying a simple box of homemade cinnamon muffins she had purchased from the neighborhood bakery. She had not planned another investigation. Instead, she wanted to thank the volunteers who had welcomed her the previous afternoon. She parked along the street, choosing once again to arrive without company, cameras, or corporate attention. As she walked through the courtyard, she noticed details she had overlooked before. Freshly painted benches. Carefully repaired fences. Colorful flower beds arranged with surprising care. Children's bicycles leaned safely against racks that looked recently reinforced. Nothing appeared expensive, yet everything reflected pride and kindness. Victoria quietly realized that communities often revealed the character of the people who cared for them. Mrs. Ramirez spotted her first and waved warmly. You came back. Victoria smiled. I enjoyed being here yesterday. Mrs. Ramirez pointed toward the maintenance workshop. Most people do after meeting Daniel. Victoria felt her attention sharpen. He is working today? As always, Mrs. Ramirez answered. He says if something can make another family's day easier, there is no reason to wait until Monday. Victoria thanked her and slowly walked toward the open workshop. Before reaching the doorway, she stopped after hearing familiar laughter inside. Emma stood beside her father holding a paintbrush while Daniel carefully showed another child how to repair a small wooden toy wagon. Victoria remained quietly outside, unwilling to interrupt. She watched Daniel patiently hand the paintbrush to the child instead of finishing the project himself. You can do this, he encouraged gently. Perfect is not the goal. Caring is. The little boy concentrated carefully before smiling proudly at the finished wagon. Daniel applauded softly. That looks wonderful. Emma clapped too. See? I told you Dad is the best teacher. Victoria smiled without realizing it. There was something remarkably peaceful about watching a man give away encouragement as naturally as breathing. Before she could step forward, her phone vibrated. Melissa's name appeared on the screen. Victoria answered quietly while moving a short distance away so she would not disturb anyone. Everything all right? Melissa sounded slightly concerned. The board moved tomorrow's merger meeting to this afternoon. They need you downtown within the hour. Victoria looked back toward the workshop where Daniel had already begun helping another resident replace the wheel on a stroller. She hesitated. For the first time in years, she genuinely wished a business meeting could wait. I will be there, she answered reluctantly. Before leaving, she walked back to Mrs. Ramirez and handed her the box of muffins. Would you mind sharing these with everyone? Mrs. Ramirez smiled warmly. Of course. Victoria looked one last time toward the workshop. Please tell Mr. Daniel, actually. She paused thoughtfully before smiling. Just tell him someone appreciated seeing kindness this morning. Mrs. Ramirez nodded kindly. I will. Victoria quietly walked back toward her car, never realizing Daniel had briefly stepped outside moments later carrying a toolbox toward another building on the opposite side of the courtyard. They remained separated by only a few yards and a handful of passing children, each completely unaware of how close they had come to meeting again. Emma noticed the unfamiliar woman driving away and looked curiously toward Mrs. Ramirez. Who was that? Mrs. Ramirez smiled as she opened the box of warm muffins. Just someone who seems to enjoy watching good people be themselves. Emma looked toward her father, who was now patiently tightening the loose railing beside an elderly neighbor's front steps. She smiled with quiet certainty. Then she picked the right person to watch. Daniel looked up after hearing Emma laugh, smiled back without asking why, and returned to his work beneath the gentle autumn sunlight, never imagining that every ordinary act of kindness continued bringing the mysterious woman from downtown one quiet step closer to discovering not only the man who had once saved her life, but the kind of life she had almost forgotten was possible. Sometimes the heart recognizes a person long before the mind discovers their name, and perhaps that is why the most important truths arrive quietly, waiting for us to notice what has been there all along. The following Wednesday afternoon unfolded beneath clear autumn skies while golden sunlight reflected across the glass towers of downtown Seattle before slowly fading toward the neighborhoods where ordinary lives carried on without headlines or applause. Victoria Hayes finished another long meeting with investors, but unlike only a week earlier, she no longer measured the day by contracts signed or financial milestones reached. Instead, she found herself wondering whether Daniel had finished repairing another apartment, whether Emma had enjoyed school, and whether the quiet community she had recently discovered was as peaceful in the middle of the week as it had been during the weekend. Melissa noticed the thoughtful expression on Victoria's face while organizing the final paperwork. You are thinking about Cedar Ridge again, she said with a knowing smile. Victoria laughed softly. Am I becoming predictable? Melissa nodded. Only in the best possible way. Victoria closed her notebook and looked toward the skyline outside her office windows. I keep asking myself why someone who could have accepted public recognition instead chose to disappear. Melissa considered the question carefully. Perhaps because helping you was never the most important part of his day. Victoria smiled gently. His daughter was waiting. Melissa nodded. Exactly. Those words lingered in Victoria's heart long after she left the office that evening. Instead of returning directly home, she drove toward a neighborhood bookstore she had visited years earlier but had almost forgotten. The small independent shop smelled of coffee, old paper, polished wood, and fresh rain drifting through the open doorway. Shelves overflowed with novels, children's stories, biographies, and handwritten recommendations from employees who clearly loved every book they displayed. Victoria wandered quietly between the aisles before stopping near the children's section where soft laughter caught her attention. Emma sat cross-legged on a colorful reading rug while flipping through an illustrated adventure book. Daniel stood only a few feet away speaking with the elderly bookstore owner about replacing a loose bookshelf that had begun leaning slightly. Victoria recognized Emma immediately from the afternoon downtown and from the community gathering, but Daniel remained partially turned away while carefully examining the wooden shelf. She instinctively stepped behind another display, not out of fear but because she suddenly felt as though she had entered a private moment that deserved respect. I can stop by tomorrow after work, Daniel said warmly. It should not take more than an hour. The bookstore owner smiled gratefully. You always refuse payment. Daniel shrugged with quiet amusement. You always insist on giving Emma an extra book. I think we are even. Emma looked up from her story with a bright smile. Miss Evelyn says books are better when they find children instead of waiting on shelves. Daniel chuckled. I think Miss Evelyn is right. Victoria listened silently, touched by how naturally generosity flowed between them. Nobody kept score. Nobody expected anything back. She noticed Daniel help an elderly customer reach a book from the highest shelf before returning to Emma without drawing attention to himself. Every action carried the same quiet grace she remembered from the downtown intersection. Before Victoria could gather enough courage to approach them, her phone rang once again. This time it was her father, Richard Hayes, calling from Boston. She answered softly while walking toward the front entrance. They spoke only briefly about an upcoming family charity event, but when she looked back inside the bookstore, Daniel and Emma had already left through the rear parking lot carrying a small paper bag filled with books. Victoria smiled despite missing them again. Somehow disappointment no longer felt frustrating. Instead, it strengthened her certainty that the man she was searching for truly existed exactly as everyone described him. The next afternoon, Daniel arrived at Emma's elementary school carrying a freshly repaired bird feeder he had promised to install near the school garden. Several teachers greeted him by name, while students hurried across the playground beneath brilliant autumn sunshine. Emma ran toward him holding another classroom project. "Mrs. Wilson says our class is collecting books for children who lost theirs in the floods across the state." Daniel smiled proudly. "That sounds like a wonderful idea." Emma looked thoughtfully at the bird feeder in his hands. "Can we give some of my books too?" Daniel paused only long enough to smile. "Only if they are books you truly love." Emma nodded confidently. "Those are exactly the ones I want another little girl to enjoy." Daniel rested one hand gently on her shoulder. "You understand generosity better every day." At that same moment, Victoria arrived at the school for an education partnership meeting Hayes Innovations sponsored every year. She stepped through the main entrance accompanied only by Melissa, preferring a quiet visit instead of a public appearance. As the principal welcomed them into the building, Victoria glanced through the hallway windows toward the playground. She saw Emma laughing beside a tall man installing something near the school garden, but several excited students ran between them, briefly blocking her view. By the time the children hurried away, Daniel had climbed down from the small ladder and carried his toolbox toward the opposite side of the building. Victoria watched only long enough to notice the familiar patience in his movements before the principal invited her inside for the scheduled meeting. During the discussion, framed student artwork decorated every hallway while children's voices drifted through open classroom doors. Victoria found herself smiling more than speaking. As she prepared to leave, she noticed a colorful poster hanging outside Emma's classroom. Across the top, written in large handmade letters, were the words "Kindness leaves footprints even after people walk away." Beneath the title, every student had drawn someone they admired. Victoria paused after noticing Emma's drawing. It showed a father holding a toolbox in one hand and a little girl's hand in the other while bright flowers surrounded them. At the bottom, Emma had written, "My dad fixes things that people can see and hearts that people cannot." Victoria stood silently before the drawing, feeling an unexpected warmth fill her heart. She did not yet know that the father in the picture was the same man whose quiet courage had already changed her own life. Yet somehow, deep inside, the distance between gratitude and recognition had begun growing smaller with every ordinary day. "I have learned that truth rarely arrives through one grand revelation because it usually gathers quietly from 100 small moments until the heart can no longer deny what the eyes have finally begun to see." The following Friday afternoon brought crisp autumn sunshine back to Seattle after 2 days of gentle rain. Brilliant golden leaves drifted across downtown sidewalks while cool air carried the scent of roasted coffee, fresh bread, and damp cedar. Victoria Hayes stepped out of another successful executive meeting, but instead of returning immediately to Hayes Innovations headquarters, she asked her driver to take a different route through the northern neighborhoods. She did not explain why. She simply wanted to see the quieter side of the city that had slowly begun changing her understanding of success. Melissa smiled from the passenger seat. "You are hoping the city introduces you to someone again." Victoria laughed softly. "Perhaps I finally learned that some of the best meetings cannot be scheduled." The sedan rolled peacefully through tree-lined streets until traffic slowed near Cedar Ridge Elementary School just as students were being dismissed for the afternoon. Parents gathered along the sidewalks while teachers waved goodbye beneath colorful banners celebrating the fall season. Victoria casually looked through the window and immediately recognized Emma walking happily beside her teacher, Mrs. Wilson. The little girl carried a stack of donated children's books almost as tall as her shoulders. Victoria felt an unexpected smile appear. Would you mind stopping for just a minute? She asked the driver. He pulled safely into a nearby parking space while Melissa looked toward the school entrance with quiet curiosity. Victoria stepped onto the sidewalk carrying no briefcase, no business agenda, and no expectation beyond enjoying one peaceful moment. Several volunteers were loading donated books into a community van that would deliver them to libraries affected by recent flooding. Without introducing herself, Victoria simply walked over and began helping carry boxes. Mrs. Wilson smiled gratefully. Thank you. We are almost finished. Victoria nodded warmly. Happy to help. Emma recognized her almost immediately. You came back. Victoria smiled. I told you I liked your neighborhood. Emma laughed brightly. Today is book day. She carefully placed another stack into the van before adding proudly. Dad said the best stories are supposed to travel until they find the next person who needs them. Victoria paused for a brief moment. Those words sounded strangely familiar, carrying the same quiet wisdom she had heard repeated in different ways by everyone who knew Daniel. Your father says many thoughtful things, she replied gently. Emma shrugged with complete sincerity. He just says what he believes. Mrs. Wilson joined the conversation while closing one of the van doors. Daniel has raised an extraordinary little girl. Victoria smiled. Everyone seems to admire him. Mrs. Wilson nodded immediately. He deserves it, although he would never ask for it. Victoria glanced toward the school parking lot. Is he picking Emma up today? He should be here any minute, Mrs. Wilson answered. At that exact moment, an older blue pickup truck slowly turned into the parking lot. Victoria instinctively looked toward it. Daniel stepped out wearing his familiar navy work shirt, jeans, and worn brown work boots after finishing another full day at Cedar Ridge Apartments. He waved toward Emma before walking across the parking lot with his usual relaxed confidence. Victoria watched him from a distance. Something deep inside her stirred so strongly that she almost forgot to breathe. She had seen that walk before. She had seen those calm shoulders, that steady pace, that quiet way of scanning the people around him before focusing completely on the person he intended to greet. Daniel reached Emma first, smiling warmly as she rushed into his arms. How was book day? He asked. Emma grinned. Amazing. She pointed proudly toward the nearly full community van. We filled almost the whole thing. Daniel looked genuinely impressed. That means many children are about to discover wonderful stories. Victoria stood partially hidden behind the open van door while listening to his voice. The sound struck her heart with startling force. Calm. Gentle. Certain. She had heard those exact qualities once before at the downtown intersection. Not many words. Just enough to make fear disappear. Daniel thanked Mrs. Wilson for everything she did for the students before helping lift the final heavy box into the van. As he reached upward, the sleeve of his work shirt slipped back slightly, revealing a simple silver Navy Challenge coin attached to his keychain by a worn leather strap. Victoria's eyes widened. Her memory returned with perfect clarity. During the afternoon outside Hayes Innovations, when Daniel had reached toward her and guided her away from danger, she had briefly noticed sunlight reflecting from that same weathered silver coin hanging near his hand. At the time she had dismissed it as an unimportant detail. Now it returned with breathtaking certainty. The voice. The little girl. The blue pickup truck. The grocery bags. The calm expression. The quiet wisdom. The silver navy coin. Every small clue she had collected over the past several days suddenly fit together like pieces of a picture that had been waiting patiently to reveal itself. Melissa quietly stepped beside her after, noticing the change in Victoria's expression. What is it? She whispered. Victoria never looked away from Daniel. Her eyes shimmered with grateful emotion as she answered almost breathlessly. It is him. Melissa followed her gaze toward the father helping Emma organize the remaining books. Are you certain? Victoria nodded slowly. I have never been more certain about anything. For several long moments she simply watched him. Daniel laughed as Emma proudly explained which books she had donated. He listened with complete attention, exactly as he always did, making his daughter feel as though her words were the most important conversation in the world. There was no performance. No attempt to impress anyone. He had no idea the woman he once helped now stood only a few yards away, finally understanding the truth. Victoria took one slow step forward, then gently stopped herself. Her heart urged her to run toward him immediately, but something even quieter asked her to wait just a little longer. She realized that after searching so hard to find the man who had saved her life, the first gift she wanted to offer him was the same respect he had unknowingly given her. She would not interrupt this precious moment between a father and his daughter. She would let him finish being exactly the man who had inspired an entire community before she ever asked him to remember the stranger whose life he had quietly changed forever. I have come to believe that true character is revealed not by what a person accepts with gratitude, but by what they quietly refuse in order to protect the values they hope their children will one day inherit. The farmer's market continued humming with cheerful conversation, while golden autumn sunlight warmed the colorful rows of fresh produce, handmade crafts, and flower stands. Daniel Carter held the bouquet of bright sunflowers carefully in one hand before smiling toward Emma, who happily skipped back carrying a small paper bag filled with apples and a jar of local honey. "Dad, look what Mr. Collins gave us," she said excitedly. Daniel looked inside the bag and laughed softly. "He slipped in 2 extra apples again." Emma grinned. "He says kindness always comes back." Daniel nodded with quiet appreciation. "Then we should remember to pass it along." Victoria watched the exchange with gentle admiration. Every conversation between father and daughter carried the same warmth, the same respect, and the same patient attention she had witnessed again and again throughout the past several weeks. Nothing about Daniel seemed different now that she had finally found him. He had not suddenly become extraordinary because she knew his name. He had always been extraordinary precisely because he never behaved as though he were. Emma noticed Victoria still standing nearby and smiled brightly. "Would you like one of our apples?" Victoria laughed softly. "That is very kind of you." Emma looked toward her father for permission. Daniel nodded. Sharing usually makes fruit taste even sweeter. Emma carefully handed Victoria one of the bright red apples before beaming with satisfaction. Victoria accepted it almost as though receiving something priceless. "Thank you?" Daniel smiled. She has always believed good things are better when everyone enjoys them together. Victoria looked from Emma back to Daniel. I can see where she learned that. They began walking slowly through the market together while musicians played a gentle acoustic version of an old American folk song nearby. Families strolled between vendor booths, children sampled fresh cider, and colorful autumn decorations fluttered in the cool breeze. The peaceful setting made their conversation feel surprisingly natural despite everything that had led them there. Victoria finally spoke the words she had been carrying for days. "There is something I would like to ask you." Daniel nodded politely. "Of course." She hesitated briefly before continuing. "Hayes Innovations has an employee recognition foundation. Every year we honor people who make extraordinary differences in the lives of others. I would like to recognize what you did." Daniel's gentle smile faded into thoughtful seriousness rather than excitement. He looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "I appreciate your kindness." Victoria waited hopefully. Daniel continued softly. "But I cannot accept." Victoria blinked in surprise. "May I ask why?" Daniel glanced toward Emma, who had wandered only a few steps away to admire a table filled with handmade birdhouses. His voice remained calm and warm. "Because she is always watching." Victoria followed his gaze toward Emma. Daniel continued quietly. "Every lesson I teach her comes from the life I choose to live in front of her. If she ever begins believing that helping someone should lead to awards, recognition, or special treatment, then I will have accidentally taught the wrong lesson." Victoria listened without interrupting. Daniel folded the bouquet gently beneath one arm. "I want her to grow into a woman who helps strangers because it is right, not because someone important might notice." His words settled deeply into Victoria's heart. She understood immediately that refusing recognition was not false humility. It was another way Daniel protected his daughter's future. Then let me do something else, Victoria said softly. Please allow me to help you and Emma in some way. A scholarship? A new home? Anything. Daniel smiled with sincere gratitude before gently shaking his head once more. We already have everything we truly need. Victoria looked around the bustling market before asking quietly, even if life could become easier? Daniel answered without hesitation. Easier is not always better. He smiled toward Emma as she carefully thanked the craftsman selling the birdhouses before returning empty-handed because she had decided to save her allowance instead. What matters most is teaching her contentment before teaching her success. Victoria felt her eyes fill with emotion. During years of building an international company, she had spoken with countless influential people, yet few conversations had affected her as deeply as these simple sentences spoken beside baskets of apples and pumpkins on an ordinary Saturday morning. Emma rejoined them carrying a small wooden bookmark shaped like a maple leaf. The lady gave me this because I helped pick up the ones that fell. Daniel smiled proudly. Did you thank her? Emma nodded enthusiastically. Twice. Victoria laughed gently. Your father has taught you very well. Emma looked at Daniel with complete certainty. He teaches me that people are more important than things. Daniel lightly squeezed his daughter's shoulder before looking back toward Victoria. Children remember what we celebrate. Victoria quietly absorbed those words. She suddenly understood why every resident at Cedar Ridge Apartments admired Daniel so deeply. He did not simply repair buildings or help neighbors. Every ordinary decision reflected the same steady principles. Before leaving, Victoria reached into her purse and removed a simple white business card. She hesitated for only a second before handing it to Daniel. I will respect your wishes, she said sincerely. There will be no public recognition, no ceremony, and no announcement. Daniel accepted the card politely. Victoria continued with a hopeful smile. But if you or Emma ever need anything, no matter how small, I hope you will allow me the opportunity to help the way you once helped me. Daniel looked at the card for a quiet moment before placing it carefully inside his wallet rather than slipping it casually into a pocket. Thank you, he said warmly. Not because I expect to use it, but because I know it is offered with a generous heart. Victoria smiled through grateful eyes. She realized she had come hoping to repay a debt, only to discover that genuine kindness could never be balanced like numbers on a financial report. Some gifts were too deeply rooted in grace to be measured at all. As she watched Daniel and Emma walk slowly toward their blue pickup truck beneath rows of glowing autumn trees, hand in hand and laughing together about which apples would make the best pie, she understood that the greatest wealth she had encountered all year did not belong to a corporation, a stock portfolio, or a boardroom. It belonged to a quiet father whose richest inheritance was the example he placed before his daughter every single ordinary day. I have discovered that the deepest respect we can offer another person is not changing who they are, but allowing their quiet example to inspire everyone else without taking away the humility they worked so hard to protect. Nearly 3 weeks passed after the morning at the farmer's market, and Seattle gradually settled into the heart of autumn. Brilliant orange leaves covered neighborhood sidewalks while cool evenings invited families onto front porches wrapped in warm sweaters with steaming mugs of coffee and homemade soup. Life at Cedar Ridge Apartments continued exactly as it always had. Daniel Carter repaired leaking faucets, replaced worn handrails, raked leaves for elderly residents before they could ask, and never once mentioned the woman he had rescued downtown. Emma continued thriving at school, filling the refrigerator with colorful drawings and handwritten essays about kindness, gratitude, and helping people without expecting applause. Their small white house remained filled with laughter, simple routines, and the quiet peace that comes from knowing enough has already been found. Across the city, however, Victoria Hayes could not forget the conversation they had shared at the farmer's market. She had honored Daniel's request by canceling every plan for a public recognition ceremony, but his words continued shaping her decisions in ways she had never expected. During executive meetings, she began asking different questions, not only about profits but about employees, families, and neighborhoods. Hayes Innovations expanded its volunteer programs, increased paid community service hours, and quietly funded several local education projects without attaching the company's name to every contribution. Melissa noticed the changes almost immediately. One afternoon she smiled while reviewing the newest community partnership proposal. "You are beginning to sound more like Daniel every week." Victoria laughed softly. "I hope that is a compliment." Melissa nodded warmly. "It is the highest compliment I could give." Several days later, Victoria received an invitation to attend the annual Cedar Ridge Community Harvest Celebration, a neighborhood gathering organized entirely by residents to thank volunteers before winter arrived. Mrs. Ramirez had personally mailed the invitation after learning Victoria enjoyed spending time with the community. Victoria accepted immediately, not because she expected another conversation with Daniel, but because she had genuinely come to care about the people whose lives reflected the values he quietly lived every day. The celebration filled the apartment courtyard with strings of warm lights, handmade decorations, fresh apple cider, homemade chili, pumpkin pies, and children's laughter echoing beneath the glowing maple trees. A small wooden stage stood near the community garden where local musicians played gentle acoustic songs while neighbors shared stories about another successful year together. Daniel spent most of the evening helping arrange folding chairs, carrying food trays for elderly residents, and making certain everyone else felt comfortable before ever sitting down himself. Emma happily led younger children through simple harvest games, cheering just as loudly when someone else won as when she won herself. Victoria watched from the edge of the gathering with quiet admiration. Every person greeted Daniel by name. Every child smiled when he passed. Every conversation reflected the same genuine affection. She realized that no award she could ever create would equal the respect he had already earned through countless ordinary days. As sunset faded into evening, the apartment manager stepped onto the small stage carrying a microphone. "Before we enjoy dessert," he said with a smile, "we have one tradition left." Neighbors applauded warmly. The manager continued, "Every year we invite residents to share stories about people who quietly made our community stronger." One by one, neighbors stepped forward. Mrs. Ramirez thanked the volunteer who planted flowers outside her porch every spring. Harold Benson praised the teenagers who shoveled sidewalks during winter storms. Parents thanked teachers, children thanked grandparents, and volunteers thanked one another. There were no trophies, no certificates, and no prizes. Only sincere gratitude freely offered. Victoria smiled, realizing this was exactly the kind of recognition Daniel believed in. Then the manager looked toward Emma. "Young lady, I believe you wanted to say something." Emma climbed onto the small stage holding a folded sheet of notebook paper. She looked briefly toward her father, who smiled encouragingly from the back of the crowd, then unfolded her paper with both hands. "My teacher says heroes are people who help when nobody is watching," she began. The courtyard grew wonderfully quiet. "I think the best heroes also go home afterward and still remember to wash dishes, fix broken toys, read bedtime stories, and make hot chocolate when someone has a hard day." Soft laughter spread gently through the audience. Emma smiled before continuing. "My dad says kindness should be so normal that it feels strange not to do it." Daniel lowered his eyes modestly while several neighbors smiled knowingly. Emma looked toward him with complete love and certainty. "Thank you for teaching me that the strongest people are the ones who make everyone else feel safe." Silence settled across the courtyard. Not the uncomfortable silence of uncertainty, but the peaceful silence that appears when every heart in the same place quietly recognizes the truth at exactly the same moment. Victoria felt tears fill her eyes as she watched Daniel look almost embarrassed by the attention, gently shaking his head while Emma hurried off the stage and wrapped both arms around him. He whispered something that made her laugh before kissing the top of her head. No applause seemed necessary. The stillness itself became the loudest expression of respect. Victoria remained quietly where she stood, understanding at last why Daniel had refused every public honor she had imagined. He already possessed something far more meaningful. He had earned the lasting trust of a child who believed with all her heart that kindness was simply the natural way to live. As warm lights glowed beneath the autumn trees and neighbors slowly returned to sharing food, stories, and laughter together, Victoria smiled with peaceful gratitude, realizing that the greatest gift Daniel had ever given her was never the moment he guided her to safety on a busy Seattle sidewalk. It was showing her, one quiet, ordinary day after another, that a life measured by compassion would always leave a deeper legacy than a life measured only by success. I have learned that the greatest miracles do not happen when someone's life suddenly becomes easier. They happen when one quiet act of kindness inspires another, and then another, until the goodness of one ordinary person begins living inside the hearts of people they may never fully realize they changed. Winter arrived gently across Seattle, dusting rooftops with a light blanket of frost, while evergreen trees stood proudly beneath crisp blue skies and the first hints of the holiday season filled neighborhoods with warm lights and cheerful decorations. Cedar Ridge apartments looked more welcoming than ever, thanks to handmade wreaths hanging from every door, colorful ribbons wrapped around porch railings, and children laughing as they built small snowmen in the courtyard after school. Daniel Carter continued living exactly as he always had. Every morning he unlocked the maintenance workshop before sunrise, greeted neighbors by name, repaired broken heaters before families woke to cold apartments, and quietly carried groceries for elderly residents whenever icy sidewalks became difficult to cross. Nothing about his daily routine had changed because he had never believed kindness depended on special occasions. Emma continued growing into the compassionate young girl he hoped she would become. She organized a winter book drive with her classmates, baked cookies with Mrs. Ramirez for neighbors who lived alone, and carefully shoveled snow from the front steps of an elderly couple before they even noticed it had fallen overnight. One evening Daniel watched her through the kitchen window as she quietly placed homemade cookies on a neighbor's porch before running back through the snow without waiting to be seen. He smiled to himself, realizing she had never asked whether anyone knew who delivered them. She had simply learned that love often worked best when it arrived without expecting applause. Across the city, Victoria Hayes stood before the large windows of her office overlooking Seattle's sparkling skyline as holiday lights reflected across rain-soaked streets below. Hayes Innovations had just completed its most successful year in company history, yet the achievement she felt proudest of could not be measured on any financial statement. Hundreds of employees had volunteered in neighborhoods throughout the city. Scholarships had quietly supported children without publicity. Community repair programs had expanded. Local schools had received books, technology, and supplies without company logos covering every donation. Melissa entered carrying the final reports before smiling. The board keeps asking what inspired all these changes. Victoria looked toward the distant neighborhoods beyond downtown. A maintenance technician who never asked anyone to remember his name. Melissa smiled knowingly. Do they believe you? Victoria laughed softly. Not completely. She looked back toward the city lights. Perhaps they do not need to. A few days before Christmas, Victoria drove to Cedar Ridge Apartments carrying nothing more than a simple tin of homemade cookies and a handwritten holiday card. There were no photographers, no corporate announcements, and no expensive gifts. She had learned that Daniel valued sincerity more than grand gestures. Emma answered the front door with delighted surprise. You came. Victoria smiled warmly. I hope I am not interrupting dinner. Emma grinned. Dad just made chicken soup. Daniel appeared moments later wearing a comfortable flannel shirt and jeans, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel before smiling with genuine warmth. It is good to see you again. Victoria handed him the tin of cookies. I wanted to wish you both a Merry Christmas. Daniel accepted the gift with quiet appreciation. Thank you. Please come inside for a few minutes if you have time. The little white house felt exactly as Victoria imagined it would. The scent of fresh bread and homemade soup filled the warm kitchen while a modest Christmas tree stood near the window decorated with handmade ornaments, school crafts, family photographs, and strings of soft white lights. Nothing appeared expensive, yet every corner reflected love, care, and belonging. Emma proudly showed Victoria a paper angel she had made at school before disappearing into her bedroom to wrap one final present for Mrs. Ramirez. Daniel poured 2 mugs of hot cider before sitting across from Victoria at the kitchen table. They spoke quietly about the neighborhood, Emma's latest school projects, and the growing volunteer programs across Seattle. Finally, Victoria smiled and admitted, "You changed far more than one life that afternoon." Daniel gently shook his head. "People choose their own paths." Victoria looked around the warm little kitchen. "Perhaps. But sometimes they need someone to remind them which direction leads home." Daniel smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Then promise me something." Victoria nodded. "Anything." Daniel looked toward Emma's bedroom door where Christmas music drifted softly through the house. "Whenever you help someone, let them keep their dignity. Sometimes that matters even more than the help itself." Victoria felt those words settle deeply into her heart. "I promise." A few minutes later, Emma returned carrying 3 small mugs of hot chocolate topped with marshmallows. She placed one in front of Victoria before smiling proudly. "Dad says hot chocolate tastes better when people drink it together." They laughed gently as snow began falling outside the kitchen window, covering the quiet neighborhood in soft white silence. Months later, when spring returned and flowers once again bloomed across Seattle, life looked remarkably familiar. Daniel still repaired broken things with patient hands. Emma still filled the world with generous little surprises. Victoria still led her company with wisdom, but now she measured success as much by lives strengthened as by businesses expanded. Their paths crossed from time to time at community events, school book drives, neighborhood projects, and local celebrations. They never tried to change one another. Instead, they quietly encouraged one another to become even more faithful to the values they already held. One sunny afternoon, Emma stood beside Daniel in the community garden watching bright yellow flowers bloom beneath the warm spring sky. "Dad," she asked softly, "do you think people ever know how many lives they change?" Daniel looked across the peaceful neighborhood before smiling with quiet contentment. "Probably not." Emma slipped her hand into his. "Maybe that is what makes kindness so beautiful." Daniel gently squeezed her hand as children laughed nearby, neighbors greeted one another beneath flowering trees, and ordinary life continued exactly as it always had. Somewhere beyond the garden, Victoria smiled as she watched father and daughter from a respectful distance before quietly returning to her own day, carrying with her the same lesson that had begun on a busy Seattle sidewalk. In the end, the world did remember the man who disappeared without asking for recognition, not because he became famous, but because every person fortunate enough to meet him slowly learned that the strongest legacy any human being can leave behind is a life so full of quiet dignity, humble compassion, and unwavering kindness that others cannot help but become a little better simply because they crossed that person's path.